Let me introduce the presenter and discussants for the second sessions. The presenter is the Professor Yande Bruyne from KU Leuven. Okay. And discussants one discussant is the Professor Thomas Margoni from KU Leuven. Another discussant is today the physically absent, but he already submitted some materials. So the Dr. Jeong lead his statements and for the discussion on behalf of him. So I give the 30 around minutes for your presentation.
All right. I hope that the slides will be projected or... well, I don't need them, but yeah, they're there, so no worries. Good afternoon, everyone. Also to those that joined from other sides of the country and the world. Good morning. I am Jan de Bruyne. You know me, who I am, but the most important thing is that I do work for... I do work for the KU Leuven Center for IT and IP Law, and that's a center focusing on IT and IP law, of which myself and also Thomas Margoni, whom I thank for bringing me into contact with this symposium, work. So we do have a lot of projects on the legal, ethical aspects of technology. We have different research lines, and one of them really focuses on AI and data. And it shall not be a surprise that the last years, a lot has been happening on AI and data. And we see this as well in the amount of research that we get, projects that we get, but also in the amount of the challenges that we get and the legal unclarities, the legal uncertainties that we may need to resolve. Now, what I will do with you today is I will do several things, but I do have the impression that the pointer is not really working well. Sorry for that. So I'll first set briefly, very shortly, the scene. Why do we need regulation of AI and data in general? I'll mainly focus on AI. My colleague, Professor Thomas Margoni, will for sure cover some data-related elements. I will pave the way for his analysis. Then I'll focus on the AI Act, the AI Liability Directive, and the revised PLD. And then I'll briefly focus on the Data Governance Act, the DGA, as we know, or the Data Act. And I will end with some concluding remarks. And to be honest, these concluding remarks may not be that legal. These concluding remarks actually relate to the previous speaker, where I think that although there's a lot of problems with the existing regimes, there are a lot of challenges, regulatory unclarities. I still think that public involvement, digital literacy is something that is key and that is at this moment missing. So at the Knowledge Center, at the CITIP, we also work on policy skills, on translating academic research to the broader society. Now, first things first, setting the scene, why do we need regulation? Well, of course, to start with, the law. I know I'm after lunch, and perhaps a lot of you may be tired, in need of the traditional after lunch meltdown, so to say, but the law is only one minor modality of regulating technology. You probably know Loris Lessig, which has like four norms in total, 4 modalities. The law is one of them, and each of these modalities has got benefits and challenges. Now, in an AI context, we see this very clear, is that there's been an interaction between all of these modalities. It started in 2018 with the strategy paper, followed by the high-level expert group recommendations on trustworthy AI, ethical norms, but that influenced, in the meantime, how the AI Act is shaped and how future tech legislation in the field of AI and data may be shaped as well. So this is my first key takeaway, is like when we talk about regulating AI, just be aware that the law is only one of these modalities, but you do have others as well. Ethics, not binding, but can have a wide scope of application. The technology itself can also regulate behavior, and then finally the market. So it's really important to take these frameworks into account when we talk about regulating artificial intelligence. Now, if we then go to the needs as to why we would need to regulate artificial intelligence, I still have a problem with the pointer. Okay, it's not working perfectly, but it works. We still need human oversight on technology. I think this is one of the key points. Why do we need AI regulation? Well, of course, because it's been mentioned by the previous speaker as well, AI is not always sufficiently objective yet. There's problems of bias leading to discriminatory outputs. I'm not saying that the AI system is discriminating. That would be fake news, because as we know, the AI system is developed within a context, shaped and used by people. So, but this is a concern. Why we need regulation is because it's not sufficiently biased, sufficiently objective yet. AI is also not sufficiently controllable yet. We know deepfakes, and here I got like a quite funny one, so to say. But in the end, it can be used, as you probably know, some researchers work on that here. It can also be used in conflicts. The use of deepfake technology, fake news, generative AI leads to conflicts or can contribute to certain political conflicts. So AI is not sufficiently objective, not sufficiently controllable, and then also it is not... okay. Sorry, okay, I got it now. And AI is also not sufficiently robust. I mean, everyone of us who's driving would stop for that sign, but of course you can trick artificial intelligence by just putting some things on the stop board. It will not stop and it will continue driving. And also we need AI that's sufficiently predictable, transparent, accountable, especially used when used in high-risk sector, for example, the medical sector, but also mobility, where the risks for humans is really extended. So do we need AI regulation? I do think we for sure need AI regulation, but again, be aware that it's more than the law. It is ethics, it is the legal frameworks, it is the market, and it is the technology itself. And I think this will become clear during my further presentation. Now, this is why we need AI. Question is, do we also need data? Of course, we have data that is being shared. We have data that can be used for a lot of different purposes, for a lot of different stakeholders. I gave you like an overview of a farm. The farming data can be used for a variety of stakeholders. The NGOs, for example, public authorities, but also developers of the sensors, for example, the farmer, him or herself. So there's a lot of benefits in sharing this data. Now, when you look at the need for data sharing, and I think everyone would agree to the need for sharing data because it brings so many benefits for different stakeholders. But if you then look at the practice, it did not seem so obvious and so easy to really start sharing data. There are problems with confidentiality, trademarks, for example, for trade secrets and so forth. There's also the problems with contract law, with sharing this according to the EU, as we said, the EU values. So you do have balances at different levels that need to be taken into account. And that is why, as voluntary data sharing does not occur, or not occur as much as policymakers, as society that we want, that EU has now adopted adapted EU data legislation. And we have the data strategy setting out, and we need to share data because it's good for different stakeholders. It would boost the economy towards a digital data economy. Professor Margoni will talk more about that during his analysis. But the idea is to share data. And there as well, the fact that it's not happening voluntary means that we need to have frameworks that somehow make it obligatory, or at least provide the conditions to start dating share according to the different stakeholders' interests, according to values, according to taking into account IP-related elements. But this is why I provided you this scheme, which actually shows how much legal frameworks are out there. So in the EU, you have the last years, you have the DSA, the DMA, the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, the AI Act, and in addition to that, several sectorial legal frameworks as well, on product safety, on product liability. So really a lot is going on AI and data-related policy. Now this is to set a bit the scene. So there are challenges with AI, hence we need AI regulation. And there are challenges with data that is not being shared, so we need also regulation of data, making sure that data is shared to move towards this common data spaces and this one data economy that the European Union wants to have. Now, my talk will be more on the AI Act. I will briefly touch upon the other frameworks as well, but I will leave that open also for a deep dive, especially on data spaces for the next speaker. But as you know, the AI Act has been adopted this year. I think 2024 has been an enormously important year for the EU. We not only have the AI Act, we not only have recently at the end of 2023 the Data Act, but we also have the AI Convention by the Council of Europe, which is yet another institute adding an additional complexity layer. So we have the AI Convention, the AI Act, but I think the European Union, and this is of course my own opinion, when it was adopted in April this year, it was often mentioned, well, the EU is the first jurisdiction in the world with AI legislation. I think this could be somehow seen as fake news because I think a lot of other countries, for example, China, already had legislation on Gen AI, on privacy, on chatbots and so forth. The only thing is, of course, that the values may be different. The principles are the same, non-discrimination, accountability, fairness of AI, but how this is given content, this of course depends upon the culture, about the country where these frameworks are adopted. So a warning is there that this Eurocentric view is somehow leading to confusion because I think the EU was not the first one to come up with a legal binding framework. Nevertheless, it is an important framework because of the fact that it really affects 27 member states, and we would assume that as with the GDPR, it will have what we call the Brussels effect, affecting other regions in the world, making sure that if they want to provide their services or their AI products in the European market, that they have to comply with these frameworks. So another key takeaway is that there's a lot of initiatives, you're not surprised by that, but that the EU recently took a very important one. Now, if we then look at the way towards the AI Act, which is, I'll try to be as cool as possible, because the lawyers are often said as being really dry speakers, but I'll try to get it more interactive as well. But the way to the AI Act has been out there for a long time. The AI Act did not come suddenly. It started in 2016, 17 with different strategies, visions. As we have seen in the United States, you see a lot of similarities. It then resulted in what we call the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence that made some ethical recommendations on trustworthy. I'm sorry, but the point is really challenging to find the signal. But I'm there. So the high-level expert group, ethical requirements on trustworthy AI, basically issued 7 key requirements, which providers of AI systems had to follow when developing AI to make sure that they would develop trustworthy, ethical artificial intelligence. So trustworthy AI is ethical, is robust, and complies with the law. Now, it then includes in this document 7 key requirements and a bunch of questions, a kind of checklist that the providers can follow. So, for example, did you ensure sufficiently human oversight? Did you make sure that there's sufficiently accountability provisions? I do think it paved the way, but at the same time, it's been criticized as well because this is just a simple checklist where you just say yes, 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 and you actually comply with these requirements. They are not binding, but at the same time, they do indeed contain the basis of how the EU, now in the AI Act, views and tries to regulate based on this modality of ethics, how the EU then came up with a more legal framework. Now, after a long process, and it started in 2021 with the Commission proposal, so in 2021, the EU institutions work in a very complex way. So the European Commission does a proposal. Afterwards is the Council and the European Parliament that start negotiating a common point of views. And then the act is then finally adopted. In the initial proposal of 2021, generative AI was totally not included. So this already shows the difficulties in regulating AI and the fact that technology can go so fast and that the legal frameworks often lags behind. And this is why I think, for example, ethical approaches or ethical, although not binding, they are more targeted. They can follow more easy, more quickly than the legal framework, which takes really a long time before it's been adopted. Now, in 2022, as you know, we have ChatGPT, and then suddenly it all changes. Generative AI became a big thing for the European institutions as well. And now in the AI Act, as we will see, it is included. Now, the AI Act, in very short, because I do not have a lot of time and I want to make sure that there's sufficient time for discussion. AI Act, in short, it starts with definition, what is AI? I mean, this is why I asked this question this morning. What is AI? And indeed, you see a lot of elements that come back based on what Daniel has said. It's a machine-based system. In the initial proposal of the Commission, it was mentioned software. So software, which is really, really, really a lot, which is far going, because software can be, basically a simple software tool will be qualified as AI under that definition. But under the final adopted definition, it's a machine-based system with varying levels of autonomy. Varying levels of autonomy that may exhibit adaptiveness, and that for explicit and implicit objectives infers from the environment. So you can already tell as a lawyer that there will be a lot of issues with this definition. What do we mean with autonomy? Not defined. What do we mean with varying levels? Not defined. What do we mean with inferring? When is some inferring from the environment? So the definition is indeed technological neutral, but it's so broad and so general and so vague that I think it will lead to a lot of discussions. To be seen how it will be applied there. I think we have some materials on that as well. But this is the first question. What is artificial intelligence? And of course, a company would be induced to say, well, I'm not developing AI systems to not be falling under this AI Act. Secondly, the AI Act. So suppose we have a system that is defined as AI, a machine-based system with varying levels of autonomy that's able to infer from the environment to make decisions that, again, would affect the environment. Then the second question is, yeah, but this AI Act, who are the primary targets? Who is included? Who falls within the scope of applications? Well, there are a lot of parties, but I think the most important ones are the providers of AI systems. So it's the parties that put the system on the system or the product on the EU market. So they develop it and they put it on the market. They have the majority of obligations. They have a lot of obligations to comply with. I'll come to that in a minute. But we may also have deployers, users. So these are also having a lot of obligations. For example, they have to use the AI system in alignment with the instructions of use. So you already feel instructions of use will become very important in an AI system. At the same time, we know from consumer law that no one reads terms and conditions. I mean, we all accept terms and conditions on a daily basis, but I think if you start reading them, it will take you one day. So we just don't do that. Ah, yeah, thank you. But I think now it seems to work. But no, leave it here. Leave it. It's perfect. Just in case technology would let us down, then we have a safeguard. No. So and then finally, so providers, professional users, and then I also think that natural persons, the affected persons, may be relevant to be here. Okay. I'll do it. Okay, it's. Okay, so suppose now we have AI. What is artificial intelligence? We know that is a very vague definition, leading to unclarities for which also not only legal scholars will be required, but also ethicists, people with a technical background, because they finding the common language. I think this will be key, because when I talk about AI safety, for example, when I talk to an engineer, he will have a totally different perspective on safety. When I talk to a computer scientist, they make fun of the definition of the legal safety. So I think common language is also the starting point, but I'll come to that in a minute. Now, sorry. The AI Act also contains some exceptions. So, for example, it only applies in the professional context. So for professional users, which means that if I would use if my kid, for example, would use the domestic robot to hoover the house and something would happen, well, he will not be covered by the AI Act. So the AI Act deals with professional users. It also does not apply to the solely military purposes. That's also excluded. Also to research and development, pure for research and development, research purposes is also not included, as is the case for the GDPR, where this free market research falls out of its scope of application. And then free and open software, open source software may also, under certain conditions, not be covered by the AI Act. So these are some exceptions before we go towards the real key analysis. Okay. So, regulation of AI, 4 modalities. Very important to remember. The very vague definition, the exceptions that we have in the AI Act that will now apply already. It's adopted, so it will apply very soon. I think if you need to remember one slide, it will be this one. So the European Union decided to go for a risk-based approach. A risk-based approach, which means that it takes into account the risks, whatever that may mean. As another, what is a risk? I think there again is different when you talk to different disciplines as a risk. But it makes a division between certain categories of AI systems. The first ones are unacceptable risks. So they say, it's not allowed in the EU. You cannot put them on the market, we cannot place them into service. For example, social scoring. AI for social scoring would not be allowed. AI to manipulate people with some harm, leading to harm, that is not allowed. So there's a whole list of prohibited AI systems. Now, note, however, that it's prohibited to put it on the market, but companies in the EU can perhaps produce it and export it. You can just not only use it in the European market. And to be honest, I think this may be an ethical concern, but first category, unacceptable risk prohibitions. Then suddenly, secondly, you have high-risk AI-based systems, very complex definitions. First of all, it refers, and I'll be very simple, it refers to products that are covered by certain legislation already and that require an independent conformity assessment. Think about medical devices that include AI. Think about machines that have AI. So these are covered already by legislation, by legal frameworks, and they are safety components, so they are considered to be high risk under certain situations. The second category of high-risk AI system relates to a specific list in the Annex 3, a list of AI uses in certain sectors and that can have certain consequences. For example, the use of AI in employment to hire or to dismiss persons is a high risk. It is allowed, but it is a high risk leading to additional obligations to which I come in a minute. So a high-risk AI system, they are allowed two situations. First, medical device, for example, that include AI, lifts that include AI, toys that have AI, and my toothbrush that uses AI could, for example, fall within this high-risk category, or a specific list. If your AI system falls in a list, then it's a high-risk system as well. I'll come to the high-risk systems in a minute. Then you have transparency risks. For example, you have specific transparency rules for chatbots, for deepfakes, for generative AI. Mostly relates to disclosing information, to making sure that you are aware that you are interacting with a chatbot. So soon there will be like disclaimers. This is not a natural person, and you may think that this is not needed. But unfortunately, we had I think last year in Belgium we had someone, after having interactions with a chatbot, committed suicide. So because the person was not aware that it was a chatbot, and I think a disclaimer may, I'm not sure whether it will resolve all situations, but at least it will provide transparency and clarity. Minimal risk AI systems are allowed, for example, AI to use in your spam filter. I don't think they pose any risks for human rights or fundamental safety. So they are allowed. And then the final level is general purpose AI models. These are the large language models that we know, GPT-4 and so forth. They are also allowed, but there are specific additional requirements on transparency, on disclosing certain information, and also on mitigating systemic risks. So this is the 5 categories. Unacceptable risk, prohibited. High risk, they are allowed, but have to comply with a lot of obligations. Transparency risks, chatbots that have to disclose information. Minimal risks that are not affected by the AI Act, spam filters, and then finally the GPI models. Okay, I'll come to the obligations now. So suppose now, and I will end in 5 to 10 minutes if it's okay. Okay, because I have half an hour, but because of the technical problems, I can gain. I gain 1 minute. No. So the most important category under the AI Act will be the high-risk AI systems. And why is that the case? Because if we talk about innovation, if we talk about the burdens for companies, compliance, it will be, of course, them. High-risk AI systems, so suppose you have indeed a high-risk AI system, then, of course, a lot of obligations apply to the provider of the AI system. The provider will have to make sure that there's sufficiently transparency. We'll have to make sure that there's instructions of use. We'll have to make sure that data is of sufficient quality, that the data governance mechanisms have been taken. We'll have to make sure that the AI system is sufficiently secure, robust. So human oversight, we'll have to make sure that there's human oversight on the AI system. Again, whatever human oversight may mean. So the moment you have a high-risk AI system, there are loads of obligations that do apply, record keeping, technical documentation requirements. So the question could be, we are now, I think, since 2018, we are 6 years after the GDPR. Practice, reality shows, conversation shows that companies are now, although not fully compliant, are now getting towards compliance, and now suddenly they have the AI Act with additional requirements, additional unclarities. So I think the link between innovation and regulation is clearly illustrated with this AI Act, and I think it goes really towards, somehow towards protection, consumer protection, which is considered very important in the European Union. To make sure that we have sufficient testing environments, the AI Act provides in what we call regulatory sandboxes, which I think is a very interesting concept. It means that you can just play, as we used to do as a kid, or we perhaps still do, I don't know. But we used to play and we can test in this protected environment, which means that companies can develop their AI systems with the involvement of the regulators. And this also allows regulators to see where, whether there's a fit between the reality and the legal frameworks, but it also allows companies to innovate without already having the enormous burden of all these obligations. Know, however, that the risk of liability remains the same. So it's been discussed already that why would a company enter this sandbox if the risk of liability remains? I think you need testing that you can test, of course, in a way that takes into account the consumer interest, that takes into account data protection, but where also there's some leniency on liability. But I think this is a very important innovation measure that has been taken. Now, some of the remaining challenges of the AI Act. Sandboxes, how will they be implemented? The horizontal approach, I think the previous speaker also mentioned it, that I think a sectorial approach could have been benefiting as well. I think, can we compare a self-driving vehicle with a toothbrush, with a highly complex AI system used for algorithmic trading? Well, they all fall under the AI liability directive and the product liability directive, but we can ask ourselves, do we need more? Do we not need more a sectorial approach instead of this horizontal approach? Coordination with other regimes, the Data Act, Data Governance Act, also establish competent authorities, also establish oversight mechanisms, but I think the coordination with all of these regimes will be quite challenging. And then finally, the definition of artificial intelligence can be quite challenging as well. Some of the remaining one, happy to discuss it at a later stage. I'll just do the final AI liability directive, and I'll skip the data because of the timing. Okay. You give them more times, okay. But I can come back to it in a later minute, and also Thomas may. So we have the AI Act on the one hand, but at the same time in 2022, we have the AI Liability Directive. I'll just discuss this one and the revised PLD. I leave the Data Act, Data Governance Act perhaps for discussions, and also because I know that Professor Margoni will briefly shed light on that, also the link with data spaces. But indeed, when we talk about AI liability, a lot of challenges do arise. It is true that if you're a victim, you bear the burden of proof. It's a traditional legal principle that you have to prove your claims. If AI would cause damage, you'll have to prove where it happened in the supply chain. You'll have to prove the causality. You'll have to prove that you incurred damage. You'll have to prove that an AI system did not work as it was supposed to work. You have to prove that it was not safe enough. AI systems are self-learning. So, I mean, there as well, adds an additional layer of complexity. Do we challenge? We have a challenge there. Do we have the necessary expertise and access to information to prove all of these elements? Can I, for example, if I would be a bank uses AI, it would discriminate against me, or the AI system would lead to discrimination, I don't think I will be able to prove that. Even with giving access to this information, I'm not sure whether I can understand this information. So this is a challenge. And this is why we have the... One more. Yeah, okay. I start to realize a pattern. The more it goes, the more I have to press. So the longer my presentation, the more I have to press. So perhaps it's time for me to. But so the AI, the liability directive, tries to get some answers to to these challenges. The fact that we don't have expertise, the fact that we don't have access to this information, the fact that there's this huge burden of proof, and it does different things. First of all, it introduces a disclosure of information. So again, the provider, and remember the provider of the AI system will have to disclose information under certain situations. Of course, this is again disclosing, but it has been mentioned already, is disclosing enough? I mean, is it not about meaningful disclosure? Because if you get access to all this data, all these thousands of PDF files of information, are you really able to understand that? So I think it's a good step to make sure that we disclose this information, but at the same time, I think it is more related to meaningful disclosure, making sure that the weaker party, I think it aligns very well with what Daniel has said, that the weaker party understands what it is all about. And I think that this AI liability directive does not really provide an answer to that. In addition, thank you. That's way better. In addition, it also contains a rebutable presumption of causality. So I'll not go into details, but there as well, when you face a certain AI-inflicted damage, it will be very difficult to prove that the AI system, the input of the system, resulted in your damage. And now a rebutable presumption of causality is introduced. So where does it leave us? Is it a good thing? Well, no, because there's still a lot of unclarity. In European Union, national countries, there is no harmonized private law, there is no harmonized civil code. It's still much national. So national liability rules in Belgium are different than the ones in Germany. So what you do get indeed is that you get, in addition to these complexities, you get another layer of complexity leading to additional problems, things that need to be interpreted by judges. For example, are the line there sufficient, proportionate? Is the disclosure meaningful? So that is not always the case. Now you may say, well, this Jan is very critical on the EU. Well, I am, but I also think they did a wonderful job in the revision of the product liability. Because there, as opposed to the AI liability directive, which is horizontal, which imposes disclosure obligations, which imposes a rebutable presumption that goes really far, that starts from concepts that, for example, Belgian law does not even have. But this one really targeted some gaps. The initial product liability directive is already out there since the 80s. Since the 80s. So it's quite a long time. So you could say the last decades there's been discussions on, for example, is software a product? The product liability directive defines product as all movables. Well, is software movable? A lot of discussions. Pro, contrast, you know how it goes in legal scholarship or perhaps in any academic scholarship, you have arguments in favor or arguments against. Ultimately, it was now decided, yes, with the revision of the product liability directive, yes, software is a product. So indeed, you see the difference between the AI liability directive, which imposes horizontal rules, and I think may not target sufficiently the gaps. The revised product liability, which is a revision of the existing ones, now explicitly mentions software is a product. And I think you can be pro or against that qualification, but it provides clarity. And by clarity, you can get the necessary insurances. So I think it provides legal certainty. So I think this is a step in the right direction. AI should be defective. For product liability to apply, your AI system must be defective. In Europe, we use the legitimate safety expectations. So a product is defective when it does not provide the safety expectations that one is entitled to expect. Consumer expectation test. One of the elements that we take into account there is the presentation of the product. Now, what happened in 2015-16, because we worked on self-driving vehicles quite a long time, in 2015 and 16, if you look at the scholarship back then, it was expected that self-driving vehicles would be there by 2020. If not, at least by 2025. Yeah, in reality, it turns out that at least in Belgium, it's not the case. But problem is there that the safety was emphasized. So self-driving vehicles will be safer, less traffic incidents, less people that would die in traffic. But by emphasizing safety, safety expectations became higher, and hence the risk of liability, because we look at, there's liability, the product is effective and it does not provide the legitimate safety expectations, but by emphasizing safety, your safety expectations became higher, and you had a problematic reasoning. Again, revised PLD provided a clear answer, provided clear elements now. So I think a gap has been remedied. That's the final one that I will discuss. Under the Product Liability Directive, the producer is not liable for defects that came into existence after the moment that the product is put into circulation, which is quite obvious. So you look at the moment when your system is put into circulation, and you look at moments for defects that exist back then. You do not look at things that happened later, perhaps 10 years later, because of usage. That would not be fair to say, well, the producer would still be held liable. But of course, an AI system may work perfectly fine when it's put on the market, but become defective after an update or self-learning abilities or a lack of update. So there you see as well that some problems do arise, again, on this reasoning. So you actually see that the law is leading to strange reasoning. The revised product liability really provides an answer there as well, saying that as long as there is control on the AI system, the manufacturer will be liable for future updates, upgrades, and so forth. As a legal scholar, you can already imagine what would it mean, the manufacturer's control. Again, this will be very important. So what are the challenges? As I mentioned a lot on the language and so forth, but at the same time, it acts as remedies for gaps that have been out there for a very long time. I'll immediately switch to my last slide, because then I'll give the floor to Professor Margoni, my colleague at CITIP. I'll just conclude. So the Data Act and Data Governance Act will come to there. It's about data sharing, making data available to train AI systems. But for the AI Act, which has been the focus of my talk now, we've seen that there are different modalities of regulation. We've also seen that the AI Act did not come suddenly. It's been in a process of a long-term process, many years. The AI Act is really not the only framework in the world. We also have the UNESCO AI recommendations. We also have the ethical guidelines. We have in the US, there's loads of principles and documents and Bill of Rights things. So it's really, the European Union is not the only binding framework, so to say. But the AI Act is there. What is AI? We've seen this problematic. The risk-based approach with certain systems that are prohibited, that are allowed, but especially this high-risk AI system qualification is important. I think we've also seen the AI Liability Directive, the revised PLD. You know my thoughts on that. Happy to discuss this further. But I do think that the most important slide is this one. There's really an AI data tsunami legislation happened in the EU. Is this good? Is this bad? I leave that in the middle. I think we needed these frameworks. I think there's sometimes some problems, and especially on coordination between all of these regimes, both national, supranational, EU, but also from within the EU perspective. But I do think, and research showed this, unfortunately, in Belgium, that the numbers are quite dramatic on digital inclusion and digital skills. I think this is the key for any successful AI transformation policies, and in the end, the adoption of legal frameworks. So I do think that digital inclusion, making sure that everyone is involved, and making sure that we have digital skills, that everyone can follow that, knows how to use a computer. I think this is key for a successful AI legislation. So thank you very much, and I very much look forward to all of your questions. And thank you for the invitation as well. It's been wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jan de Bruyne, for your informative presentation on the EU's regulation framework on AI, especially the Discover AI. Okay. So, Professor Thomas Margoni, are you ready?
Yes. Hi. Hello. Can you hear and see me?
So go ahead. You have around 50 minutes. Okay.
I will try to stick to my time very precisely. So thank you very much, everyone, for the invitation. Sorry for not being there with you in person, but I'm glad that I was able to join you online. I was also very interested in following the presentation that Professor De Bruijn just gave. We know each other, of course, but when you work together, sometimes it is even more difficult to discuss about the content of your research, because you are so busy, you are absorbed by the different tasks of the job that then, you know, the substance, what should be the main essence of the research sometimes doesn't get enough attention, and that's a pity because I learned very much. So very well done, Jan. I have to update my slides after your presentation. So I will try to focus on a couple of aspects in my reaction to Jan's presentation that will then lead me to ask Jan's a couple of questions. As said, I will be looking specifically at the relationship between the AI regulation, the AI Act, but not only, as we have learned, and data. And this is very important for two main reasons. AI, or at least the type of AI that we are experiencing nowadays, largely based on machine learning and similar techniques, relies on data. So without data, there is no AI. Not only that, but the way in which we regulate data becomes a form of regulating AI. Because if we need data to develop AI, the way in which we set the conditions to access and reuse the data has a direct impact on AI. And therefore, I think that, and this leads me to my second point, because in the European Union, as we have seen, there has been a lot of data-related legislation in the last legislature that is about to end. We find ourselves in a system where we have AI directly regulated by AI legislation, but also we could say indirectly regulated through the regulation of data, personal and non-personal. And I think this is a good element to take into consideration. Often when we speak about data regulation, we refer to personal data. In the EU, we have, at least in the 4 years that are elapsing now, a new wave of non-personal data legislation. Now, as the slides point out, we have to keep in mind the complexity also of the EU regulatory system. Jan has identified some of them, but not all the laws that we have in the EU are harmonized at the EU level. Some remain domestic, some are harmonized, some are not harmonized, and that's the part that we call domestic law. Some part of this domestic law is harmonized, and some part of this domestic law is harmonized through directives. Some other parts are technically not harmonized, but uniform law, meaning that are covered by a regulation. So to give you an example, the AI Act is a regulation, so it's directly applicable, is the same in all 27 member states, but a directive, so the AI Liability Directive, is a framework legislation that needs to be implemented in EU member states. Just to give you an example that comes from my own field, the copyright and intellectual property, we have more than 12 directives and 2 regulations. If we can go ahead with the slides, we see that in the data and digital legislation that includes AI, we have other 8 regulations plus a directive. And here is also interesting to note that at some level we have many more directives, and some other level we have many more regulations. And then the final overlapping regulatory dimension is made complex not only by overlapping concepts, but also, so to speak, by overlapping competencies in the sense of jurisdictions. In addition to that, we have the policy vision of the European Union, which in the field of data has been extremely influential, both in terms of policy documents such as the European Strategy for Data, but also with specific initiatives such as EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, which is a project, is a policy objective, but is also a source of soft regulatory rules, such as, for example, the development of common standards or common metadata. And then if we click again on the slides, we see that we have a whole array of other regulatory constraints that are connected to technology. that are connected to standards, that are connected to contractual practices and business models. And of course, all these variables, all these regulatory variables, not only may overlap or sometimes even conflict, some other times become perfectly complementary with each other on a level that is dependent on the specific topic of regulation. Think, for example, and I will use this example often, AI regulation and copyright. So how you can access works protected by copyright to train your AI systems, but also by national and EU law. And EU law is one of the main, objectives of EU law is that of harmonizing the internal market, and in this case, the internal market for data. Because one of the dangers that we see from an EU point of view is that different member states may start legislating in diverging directions with regard to data. This is often a very solid basis for EU law intervention, so the protection and the harmonization of internal market. So common European data spaces as a regulatory concept is precisely this. So is a whole body of intervention at the policy, regulatory, and market level to create a common data space for Europe, or in other words, an internal market, a harmonized internal market for data. So a space where data can freely flow and be exchanged in order to create more value, economic, but also social, also cultural. This concept of European common data spaces is very important and is gaining more and more traction in the EU. It's still new, so I will spend perhaps a couple of words on that in order to explain you why I think it's relevant in general for data, but also specifically for AI. We have a few definitions that finds recognition in the law. The first one, we find it in the Data Act. So common European data spaces are defined as purpose or sector-specific or cross-sectorial interoperable frameworks of common standards and practices to share or jointly process data. And this is quite interesting, I think, because you can really observe the ambition of the EU regulator to go beyond national borders and create a system where data can be freely exchanged. But perhaps even more relevant for today's purposes is the reference made in the AI Act that refers to European common data spaces established by the Commission, and the facilitation of data sharing between businesses and with government in the public interest will be instrumental to provide trustful, accountable, and non-discriminatory access to high-quality data for the training, validation, and testing of AI systems. So here, related to the AI Act and to the regulation of AI in Europe, I think is extremely evident how the ambition of the European Union is to create a regulated space for the exchange of data. So to create the, if you want, the market conditions to incentivize private actors to exchange data to a higher degree in order to benefit all the sectors of the European society. For economic development, but also for technological, social, and cultural development. And then a more perhaps technical definition is the one that has been developed by the Data Spaces Support Center, which is a major project to which our center, CITIP, is the leading partner for the legal dimension. Is an infrastructure that enables data transactions between different data ecosystem parties based on the governance framework of the data spaces. If we go to the next slides, we can observe that there are a number of elements that characterizes data spaces, but the two main important one in the blue box at the bottom, identified among other sources in the second staff working document on data spaces, are that there needs to be an infrastructure, a data infrastructure, and a data governance framework. So these two elements are characteristics of data spaces from an EU point of view. But the other bullet points that I have here are also very, very important to understand the regulatory goal of the EU action in this area. So the fact that data spaces need to be privacy preserving, that need to embed the EU core values in order to develop a fair, transparent, proportionate, and non-discriminatory system to favor the exchange of data, that data holders can share, but will be able to retain a degree of control on the data that is being exchanged, are all very important elements, especially if we look at them from the perspective of the development of AI. One of the dangers that we see, particularly from an EU point of view, is that we will fall behind the race of AI development, because it's very difficult to compete with other global major players that have already entered the market decades ago, and they already have much more access to data than the European-based players may have. This is certainly true from a quantitative point of view, but through this regulatory concept of data spaces, I think that my intuition is supported by policy, if not already legislative signals, is that we can compete on the qualitative level. So it will be more difficult in the EU, and it will remain more difficult in the EU to have access to data. The legislation, both in terms of, for example, personal data protection, but also copyright rules, creates higher access costs than in other legal systems that have more lenient exceptions on copyright, for example, or also in relation to trade secrets. But the approach that the EU wants to achieve is based on favoring the exchange of high quality data that has been already cleaned up, that has been debiased, that has been already tested. And this is the goal of all these recommendatory elements that we have seen. Now, here in these slides, I just offer you a visual representation of the fact that these data spaces already exist. The EU has already identified 10 now. There has been a few recent additions, vertical or sectorial data spaces. The currently existing and operating one are in the field of health, industrial manufacturing, agriculture, finance, mobility, etc. But more are to come. And not only top-down, in the sense not only promoted and sponsored by the EU. Here I think that the EU is trying to create a sort of critical mass that will then lead to a situation where many bottom-up or private initiatives will develop within this context of data spaces. Next slide, please. Here perhaps is a bit more of a theoretical reflection on what we as scholars see it's happening. And we have often defined this as a transition from a data property to a data governance model, because there is so much attention to the governance dimensions of data and data spaces. We see that the role of traditional private law categories is becoming less and less relevant. As Jan pointed out before, is also an issue of competence, in the sense that in the field of private law, for example, property law, there is far less harmonization than in other fields of law. And because this is essentially a European-driven, not a member state, so here it's like the juxtaposition between federal and state competence, then obviously the regulatory focus of the European Union action focuses on the competencies that they have. But at the same time, we see the introduction of a lot of concepts that are more traditional of public or administrative law, for example. So the creation of a lot of independent administrative authorities that have regulatory powers in controlling the compliance with this regulation, but also many other elements such as fairness, data altruism, and ensuring that there is a fair allocation of value in data transactions. So it's a really revolutionary approach to the regulation of data exchanges that, as I said, will have an impact on possibly every sector of EU law that is connected with data, and therefore particularly the AI field. The last slide, I think it's the following one. Here I have a few examples for you. I will not go specifically into the details, but it's just to show you that these things that we are discussing that have obviously an element of theoretical reflection are already good law, are already part of the obligations that today in the European Union are actionable. So if you're a player acting today in the EU, these are laws that can be immediately used as a base for a claim or for a request. And it's a lot of them, and they all have happened in the last 4 years. So we are also in a kind of exciting moment for us, for lawyers and researchers in the EU, because all of this legislation is in place, but to a very large extent has not yet been tested. So I think that the next years in this area will be extremely, extremely exciting. This is, if I'm not wrong, please go to the next slide, but it should be a thank you slide. Well, sorry, a little bit of self-referencing. I think nowadays this is called a selfie. So this is my overview of the subsector of AI regulation connected to data. If I'm correct now, I can ask a couple of questions to Jan, or should I wait that the next discussant makes his intervention? Please advise.
Thank you, Professor Margoni. We have another discussant. Professor Hun-Yeong Kwon is the Dean of Graduate School of Information Security, Korea University. Korea University is one of the top private universities in Korea. But I am sorry, he is absent physically, but he submitted his material for discussion. So Dr. Jung lead his discussion materials.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Hi, my name is Chi-Hae Chung. So I'm going to read through the discussion material that is shared from Professor Kwon. If I may, I would like to add really brief questions in the end, because I don't think I'm going to have another chance with my microphone. So, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hun-Yeong Kwon, working as a professor at the School of Cybersecurity in Korea University. It's a pleasure to meet you all, not in person, but yeah, in person. The European Union, through programs like Horizon Europe, strives to enhance technological competitiveness by investing in research and development. Simultaneously, the EU ensures that its citizens can safely manage and utilize technology through strong protective regulations represented by the GDPR. As highlighted in the previous presentation, the EU's AI and data regulations are designed as regulatory frameworks to ensure the safety and reliability of AI and data technologies. With major acts and complementary directives, the EU proactively manages the risks posed by AI and data technologies, fostering their safe and responsible use while also establishing a legal safety net to protect users. AI is applied in various physical environments today, sometimes replacing human decision-making or actions, recommending the most suitable options and supporting automation-based systems. As technology is deeply involved not only in virtual, but in everyday physical environments, defining and judging the actions of the technology itself, as well as human actions influenced by technology, becomes an important issue. In this context, the primary pillars of the acts and directives discussed, as well as the future challenges related to AI and data technologies, frequently center around the issue of liability. The jurisdictional authorities enforcing the laws, the proof of damages, the compensation for those damages, and etc., are crucial topics of discussion regarding actions and accountability. Furthermore, the socioeconomic changes brought about by AI are rapid and significant, necessitating the establishment of new relationships due to the emergence of numerous new stakeholders. It is essential to respond effectively and stably to those rapid changes from the existing order. Consequently, a critical area of discussion includes how various regulations surrounding new technologies are compatible with or can be coordinated with existing laws and regimes. So, how has the regulation of AI and data technologies evolved until now? The initial discussions on AI regulation were about the ontological status of AI. Ethical issues such as liability for AI behavior and the implications of superintelligence on human existence were discussed. As the risks that AI can cause due to technological advances have been materialized in various aspects, it has become necessary to discuss the practical role of AI principles. However, applying norms to rapidly evolving technologies was not only difficult to prove their validity and adequacy, but also regulations had to be made in a way that did not hinder the benefits that AI providers to society and the development of technologies. Therefore, voluntary compliance guidelines were announced by the private sector and various countries in the form of voluntary compliance. AI ethics and standards began to be actively discussed following the 2016 Google DeepMind Challenge match between AlphaGo and Lee Sedol, with a particular focus on transparency. From the late 2010s and to the early 2020s, various IT companies such as Microsoft, Google, Kakao, Samsung, IBM, and Naver, as well as national and international organizations like Japan, the EU, the US, and UNESCO, each announced their own AI ethics and guidelines. With the launch of ChatGPT in 2022, discussions accelerated around works and rights and the unethical use of the technology. But anyway, self-regulation, being based on trust and commitment, is not free from problems inherent to its fundamental characteristics of voluntary compliance and arbitrary interpretation. This has led to the initiation of regulatory approaches at the national and regional levels. Acts like the EU's AI Act and Data Act reflect this necessity. Similarly, the Korea Communications Commission recently proposed a bill to protect users of AI services, and similar regulatory movements are being observed in the US, Canada, and other countries. However, government-led regulation alone has limitations in keeping pace with the rapid technological advancements and maintain societal trust. While government-led regulations are generally broad and comprehensive in scope, they may be slow to respond flexibly to specific technical issues immediately. Therefore, a harmonious balance between governmental and regional regulations and self-regulation is necessary. Self-regulation promotes technological innovation and allows companies to respond more flexibly. For this to be effective, corporate social responsibility is essential, and institutional support is needed to ensure the effectiveness of self-regulation. Ultimately, ensuring the safe and responsible use of AI and data technologies requires paramount communication between the public and private sectors. The government, industry, academia, and civil society must consistently collaborate to set the direction of regulations and secure both technological advancement and social trust. This approach will help maintain a balance between stability and timeliness in regulating AI and data technologies. Thank you. And if I may, can I add like 2, 3 short bullet point comments? Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I really, really enjoyed it. So what I wanted to talk about is like, I think you talked a lot about like what to look into, like who is responsible for what, that kind of question. But the questions that I want to look into is what are we going to regulate and how are we going to regulate? So about the first question, I remember there is talks about like rule of law and how AI system can disrupt such an idea, as the basis of rule of law is legality, and it has to do a lot with clarity, which includes such factors as specific entity and ownership, as well as accessibility to the law. But one of the papers that Professor Thomas Margoni states that data should be considered as property, cannot be easily considered as property. So like we have to talk about data governance instead. So like from reading that article, I was thinking that, you know, like what are we actually trying to regulate is kind of like mingled all together in one document. For instance, like, are we talking about AI algorithm itself, or AI algorithm development, or its data, or the use of data, or who owns what, and how can somebody actually own the data? Those kind of questions still exist, and we don't have answers to that. But we already have the acts and guidelines for such a thing that we didn't successfully manage to define. And the second question would be, so how are we going to regulate? And well, regarding your talks about AI Act, I was thinking like, could it be considered as an overarching regulation direction that could be considered as functional or applicable in reality? Because as you mentioned, different industries and actors need different levels and factors of regulation when developing or using the AI or AI technologies. So having this AI Act could be very meaningful, but then is it really useful in reality is another question. And along with that, like, how are we gonna define where to go and how to regulate things? For instance, you mentioned about different kind of regimes and different kinds of values and culture backgrounds. So there's a paper that I work with Daniel, and then it's talking about the comparison between AI ethics guidelines between Western versus East Asian perspectives. And the question is that how different values and supporting social and political systems can be applied into the discussion of AI regulatory discussions as a whole in the global level. So maybe what I think is like these kind of questions and discussions are largely dealt by Western-centered point of view. So wouldn't it be problematic if we want to make it into a global level kind of general sort of regulatory directions? And very lastly, not only values, but also purposes and specific terms like risks or biases, or even like what's right and wrong could be different. So like where and who should be talking about this, and who should decide which is right or wrong, or where we go would be another question. And really, really, very lastly, when we're expanding this discussion into the international level, you talked about coordination of different levels of regimes. So considering this regime as the nation state or international regime-wise, there's going to be different layers of conflicts between the countries because they hold different kinds of conflicts or issues going on within their nation state. So like, how would you like to advise me thinking about that, such a thing? So these are everything. Thank you so much once again.
Yeah, if that's okay for Thomas, I will first answer to the discussant here, because there's been a lot of questions, and I risk to forget them. So so I'll do it first, if that's okay for you. All right. So the first question on what are we trying to regulate? Well, I do not know. Well, data, the Data Act, but Thomas will correct me if I'm wrong, or we'll talk about it more. The Data Act deals with access and use of data. So it's creating value because of whom are we giving access to data. So there are different parties in the Data Act, the data holders, the data users, and third parties. So there's a whole mechanism allowing the data holders to share it under certain conditions with third parties. So this is the thing. These connected devices create data. IoT data, for example, well, the Data Act deals with who can create value out of that and who can have access and how to deal with that. The Data Governance Act, I did not discuss this, but this is a question on data, is also on protected data that the government has. So that data also relates to the use of data. So the protected data government that is protected by data protection or by IP. Well, under certain conditions, it can make that data available to, again, certain recipients. This is for the data, but more important on the AI Act, what is being regulated on the what? Well, I'm quite sure that they deal with a proper, when it's put on the market, to make sure that internal market is guaranteed. So this is the first aim, making sure that the internal market on AI is working, that you have a level playing field between consumers in different countries. So this is an important aim, but it more looks also at once it's put on the market. What are the requirements once it's put on the market, once it's placed on the market, then the what deals with the placing of a service, placing of a product on the market, or the putting into service of a certain AI service. So they really look at the moment when an AI is entering the market. So all the training before entering the market is not the primary scope of the AI Act. And they also look at the use of AI. So for example, there's a lot of obligations for users. For example, they have to use it according to instructions of use with the AI systems. They have certain monitoring obligations. They have certain reporting obligations. So they look at the use of an AI system as well. Important is that the AI Act does not deal with liability. It does not explicitly deal with liability, although, of course, the obligations for providers, the obligations for users can be used to determine liability. You can say, well, you violated the AI Act because you did not use the AI system according to the instructions of use. So it is relevant for liability, but the focus of liability is not the main core of the AI Act. As to the what, and it's a bit related to how, well, I do think that this framework is important. It sets the scene. But on the other hand, one should not underestimate the importance of standardization. Because now we have loads of obligations in the AI Act. For example, making sure you have sufficient data quality, preventing bias, ensuring fairness, transparency. But now what will happen is that standardization bodies, they will adopt the standards. So they will translate these legal frameworks towards something that is really more important. So some say that the real power now lies with the standardization authorities. And I do think indeed that this may be the case. And this creates additional problems because as opposed to the European legislation process, it takes many years, but it involves parliament, council, public society, just public consultations, whereas standardization bodies are private actors and they don't have this democratic way of working. So that's another challenge that could arise with the data governance. Is there a lot of freedom for providers? I'd say yes, because of course, we have a principle in the EU under EU safety legislation that says that when you comply with a certain harmonized standards, so if there are harmonized standards and you as a producer, for example, complies with them, there's a presumption that your product complies with the applicable framework. So this is now included in the AI Act as well. If the moment their harmonized standards have been adopted, then there's a presumption of conformity under certain conditions. And these providers of high-risk AI systems, especially for this list of high-risk AI systems in education, but also in employment, in critical infrastructure, migration, well, they are given the power when there are harmonized standards for self-assessment. So they can start doing their own conformity assessment of their own products. Some have said, well, this is a huge conflict of interest, which because you develop something which you then certify. And I do think that there may be a valid ground on that, but at the same time, we should not overestimate regulators as well. Do they have the knowledge? Do they have the expertise already to develop these standards, to make sure that, to check this compliancy? I think at this moment, a lot of private actors still have more knowledge and are best able to self-certify that. So I do think there will be challenges now, even with this adoption of the AI Act. There's also a gradual implementation that's now been adopted. It will only apply, I think, in 2 years, but there are certain sanctions that do already apply. So after 6 months, for example, prohibited AI systems will be already after 6 months, you will not be able to put them on the market. So this is a bit the how, and then the where we go to. I like talking about global regulation on AI, but legislation on a global level, binding legislation on a global level on AI, I don't see that happening, to be honest. I've been involved as a Belgian representative in the UNESCO AI recommendation, and if you see for a non-binding document how long and how difficult that process was, how much political issues there were, and of course for a legal scholar it was interesting to see how politics really works. So you may be more familiar with that, of course, but if you see the challenges there, the cultural differences, the country interests at stake, they were only able to adopt non-binding, high-level AI recommendations, which contains a lot of unclear notions. For example, ethical liability. I don't think these combine, because like ethical is at zich not binding. Liability is something binding, I'd say. I think ethical accountability would have been better, but this is just a terminological issue. But so I don't see AI regulation at the hard level, at the international level, I don't see. At this moment, it can change, but I don't see it coming. Legislation, regulation, I think of the modalities. Yes, ethics, we can have perfectly there, we can have perfect ethical norms, but also standardizations. The ISO, IEEE, all these bodies will adopt standardization, and by that, they will also regulate behavior. And then there was the last, or was this covering all the questions?
That's pretty much it. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're very much welcome. Well, yes, I would love to respond to Thomas, but I will first listen to his questions and concerns.
Thank you, Jan.
So,
I think the answers that Jan gave are very interesting. So from my point of view, trying to link some of the observation raised by Dr. Chung with Jan's responses, I think that there are two themes that perhaps I would like to bring to your attention. The first one is the importance of regulatory frameworks. So should we regulate AI? It is an ongoing discussion, the regulate versus innovate. And sometimes the practical joke that we have is that, the EU has the AI Act, but virtually no major AI player. Whereas the US has, all major AI or almost all major AI developers and no AI Act. So the EU regulates and the US innovates is sometimes the way in which it is reported. I do not fully agree with this vision because it's true that there are values that are embedded in regulation, but values are also embedded in technology. So technology becomes, and that's also the point that Jan was making at the beginning, also a way to regulate the choices, economic, social, technological, political, that we make in the design of technology have a regulatory dimension. So the real question is, how do we regulate, not whether we regulate. We will regulate consciously or unconsciously. The form of regulation will change because, of course, a private actor designing a technology, and that's the example that Jan was also giving with regard to standards, have different accountability degrees and obligations than a public body with all the limitations of the public discourse. So here, I think is one important, interesting element is that of the importance of public participation in policy making, and I know that Jan has followed a lot this conversation from the AI point of view. So maybe one first point would be to invite you to reflect a bit more on the role of public participation in policy making at the AI level, both for the AI Act and the AI liability. The other element that was mentioned was how do we regulate legal concepts that are different? This is a problem, but as we said, regulation happens anyway. In the EU, we chose to regulate in a certain direction because that was the competence that the EU had. So to give you a practical example, do we have property rights in data? Who knows? We don't know at the EU level. We know probably the answer at the member state level. And at the member state level is that in the property law traditions of certain member states, you need a product, so something that is tangible in order to have property. And therefore, in that case, data cannot be considered property. In other member states, you don't have these requirements, and therefore, intangibles could be object of a property right. Now, you have these divergent standards, but you also have no competence of the EU to regulate property law. So the answer is simply to choose a different regulatory venue and to avoid the issue of data property altogether. And that becomes a bit of a, of a direction of navigation that then leads you to consider, well, then what are the regulatory concepts that we have here? In the field of data, and especially of the Data Act, we have the concept of co-creation. We have the idea of access and portability rights also for non-personal data, which I think it's something very new. Jan said that maybe we should repeat it. Right now, under EU law, if you have a smart fridge, you have a right to have access to the data that the smart fridge records, and you have a right to ask, or at this point to order, the smart fridge manufacturer to transfer those data to a third party that you have selected, and that third party can including be a commercial competitor. So this is a revolutionary change in the law, because until now we gave for granted that we don't know who owns the data, but because the manufacturer manufacture it, they essentially decide what to do. So at this point, I'm sorry, it was a bit of a longer answer, but my question for Jan, in the sense of the role of different regulatory levels, is how does it work out for the in terms of AI liability? It is a directive. So how do you see this developing? How harmonized are already the laws of member states, or how revolutionary are the provisions introduced by the AI liability directive, and how will this play out? Will it work? Because we know that sometimes when the harmonizing attempts are too ambitious, we open up gaps for national divergences once again. And in all this, what is the role of the regulatory agencies that we are creating both at the EU and the national level? The AI office is, going back to the AI Act, a clear example. But we are creating so many regulatory agencies with so much regulatory power, then that's probably where the big game of answering all these questions will be played. What do you think, Jan?
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas. And I think indeed we should talk way more often at CITIP to have coffees together, to leave the more admin work and to go out to have like these discussions more content-wise, because you raise a lot of interesting points as the other discussant. So thank you for your questions and your insights. I think the first question on public participation, well, as you know, the European Union during this process allows consultation. So we did this with the Leuven AI on the white paper, so an institute within Leuven, where we provided feedback. We also provided online feedback on questionnaires. So the EU collects a lot of views. And then they put it into statistics. What are the views of the SMEs? What is the public, the general public? What is the civil society? So these are the traditional ways of working. But with the Knowledge Center, so CITIP from Leuven is part of the Flemish Knowledge Center on Data and Society, so it's established by the Flemish government. We did an additional exercise, which is called policy prototyping. So we invited different stakeholders with different backgrounds, so as representatives of AI developers that were developing generative AI, deepfakes, medical AI. We invited civil society, lawyers as well, legal consultants, and we let them work on two provisions of the AI Act, namely instructions of use. High-risk AI systems have to be accompanied by instructions of use, and think about these chatbots that have to disclose information and transparency. We looked at them and it turns out that there were still a lot of problems when you have to put this into practice. So based on that exercise, like how do these stakeholders, these groups, how do they interpret it? What is missing? What is accessible? What should be better? We provided additional policy recommendations. And I think public participation, such as these exercises, are really useful, but of course, very time consuming. And yeah, I think we have to be realistic as well. It took us a year to come up with a report based on this participation. In the end, it led to prototypes of instructions of use, which can be useful also for people into industry. But public participation, previous speakers know way more about that. I think it's great, but I think in practice it can really also slow down the legal process. But I think it's needed. As to the second question, how do we regulate different concepts? And you refer to ownership of data, property of data, which is indeed one of these contested concepts, and also showing the importance of national law. I think that we need to regulate for sure. That's beyond doubt. But for example, in Belgium, we have the Code Napoleon from 1804, which is now on liability rules, is only now being changed. So it has survived so many evolutions, but now it's being changed. So do I think that we need AI? And this connects me to your second question. Do I need to think an AI liability directive? No, I don't think so, because it relies, first of all, on concepts that, for example, Belgium does not have. For example, it departs from the concept, the duty of care, liability when there's a failure with the duty of care. But Belgian law as such does not have the concept of a duty of care. We have a standard of care, but we do not have a duty. I do not need to be uncareful or careful. It's only when my careless behavior causes damage that I can be held liable. Only if these three requirements are met, but there's no duty of care as we have it in the UK, for example. So basically, this directive is by that already not compatible with Belgian law. I also think that there are so many alternatives already that can be relied upon to remedy this burden of proof. For example, Belgium got disclosure obligations, allowing also the judge in certain situations to reverse the burden of proof. So we have these mechanisms, and every member state also got these kind of mechanisms. So I do think that at the national level, there are different ways to come up with solutions. Of course, it's not one way, and I think the idea of the AI liability directive was to come up with one way, but it needs to be translated, and as far as I understood, it has not been, as opposed to the revised PLD, not been politically agreed already, and I think this is because of the complexity, the fact that it did not take into account, as you mentioned, like the different layers of EU, of the complexity in private law, for example. So the AI liability directive, although it focuses on the reversal of burden of proof, I think it relies on a lot of unclear concepts that will have to be interpreted by judges, and hence potentially leading to even more diversity within this framework, as opposed to the revised PLD, which finds gaps and remedies them very targeted. And I think that's a better approach. As to the enforcement, because of course, this is also an important question. What about the enforcement? Well, as you know, the AI Act, the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, all establish competent authorities. Perhaps some of you do not know the complexity of Belgium, but we've got 8 governments, we've got 3 regions, we've got competences at the regional level and at the federal level. So at this moment, it's still not clear who will be the markets, who will be the competent authorities for AI. So I think, as Thomas mentioned previously said, we now have the frameworks, but the coming years, we will test it, and we will see what will happen. I think this will be for sure the case for enforcement, for authorities to be established. Good news, though, to end on a very positive note, the AI office has officially been launched yesterday. And we got more information on that. So in the AI Act, there will be an EU AI office, which will especially focus on the general purpose AI models with systemic risk. So they will have a lot of supervisory powers there. And it will consist of 5 different units on compliance and regulation, on AI safety, on robotics, on responsible research. So this is really 18 hours old news. So I'm very happy to share this news with you here today. So I hope that answers your question, Thomas, and thank you very much.
Any comments or any question from audience? Rose? Yeah, Kelly?
I have a couple of questions. The first one really stems from your conversation over the definition of AI, and also the challenges that were part of the process of developing the EU AI Act, given that ChatGPT dropped and generative AI was added into the mix. So the big takeaway here is that there's a struggle or the need to balance specificity on one hand and flexibility on the other, right? In discussing the definition of AI, you pointed out that there are challenges that, it's not clear what some of these terms mean. And given that we're in a realm where the technology will be rapidly developing and changing over the coming years, how should we think about specificity and flexibility and the implications of striking the right balance for regulating AI? We think about this a lot from a political science perspective, so I'd love to hear your thoughts as a legal scholar. And then my second question is really trying to dive in a little bit deeper on one aspect around enforcement. And so I'm thinking here about possible auditing or compliance assessment structures that might be set up. And we've all been talking about, there's a lot of attention to sort of transparency, disclosure, the role of the public in lots of other parts of the AI development and life cycle process, right? Consulting the public or disclosure, incident reporting around harms or risks or use cases. But can you say anything about what it might look like to have transparency standards, disclosure, public consultation, or at least public disclosure around the auditing or the enforcement process in, again, enforcing the EU AI Act?
Okay, so thank you very much. I do reckon that the second question is very challenging to answer for a simple legal scholar as myself, but I'll try to do my best. Definition of AI, indeed. In 2021, the Commission proposed a definition based on software. This was heavily criticized by industry. Eventually, it took out the definition by the OECD. Just as in the US documents has been discussed this morning. So how should we look at specific regulation of AI? I think there are two approaches. Either you go for a broad, general technological neutral definition that will survive a lot of evolutions, as is the case now, or you go to something specific with the risk that it may not survive technological evolutions. We've seen this with a very strict definition. And this is why I think instead of focusing on finding a definition, I would propose that we look at how the AI Council of Europe developed its AI convention, where it departed from a technological neutral definition, but put more focus on the consequences of AI. I mean, I don't think we need to look at what is a definition. I think we need, as a society, individual or as a collective, we need to make sure that this technology is developed in a way that it would not harm people. So I think we need to look at this definition a bit backwards and look at preventing potential harm as main cause. Whatever the definition they may use, I just need to be sure that harm is prevented. In that regard, the proposal of the Commission in 2021 did not contain any rights for people that got affected by AI. So there's no right to lodge complaints, there was no rights to appeal and stuff, but now this has also been remedied. Now, under the AI Act, you can file complaints if there are problems with a certain AI system at the national competent authorities. The AI office will have supervisory powers when things go wrong. So there's a whole bunch, as in the GDPR, granting rights to not data subjects, but AI subjects that may be affected by AI. So I think this will be the first question. I don't think there's a need to really find a hard definition. I think we need just to look at the consequences, because that is what matters, right? And you see this a lot with tech legislation. It's not as much on regulating specifically the technology, but more on preventing harmful consequences for society, making sure that it's developed in a trustworthy, compliant, good way. So this is my first key takeaway. Enforcement. Also on AI, last thing, now it's AI hype. perhaps in some years it was something new, probably. But then as well, the same problems do arise. So I think we need to also look at it from a perspective and first assess whether what we have as frameworks are not sufficient. I think some frameworks have been adopted way too quickly, whereas, for example, in liability law, you find answers on problems now. Questions of autonomous vehicles, who's liable in case an autonomous vehicle where you have no control causes damage? Well, we found case law from the 70s already in Belgium where they make an analogy between a driving instructor and a pupil. And they said acts of the pupil can be attributed to the driving instructor. So you could assume the same logic, acts of the vehicle can be attributed to the driver as long as there's control. So I'm just saying that we can find solutions in the past for certain contemporary problems. As to enforcement, as I mentioned, this will maybe a bit challenging to answer, but I think public disclosure certification, I think when we talk about enforcement, I think there will be a move towards automated checking. There will be a move towards automated compliance checking where it will be like smart contracting, blockchain, and all these things that will be used to check compliance with frameworks. I don't think we will do it in a, hopefully, I don't think we will have to do it in a manual way. I think we have research ideas going on in that regard. So I think automation can be used there as well to automated compliance. I think this could be a way forward. I think on transparency, I think we have to ask ourselves, and I think more research may be needed there, what do we expect from, what does a citizen, what does the wider public expect from instructions of use of an AI system? Because a lot of research, at least in consumer protection, GDPR, shows that we do not read that. We do not read all these terms and conditions. So the question could be, why would we bother adopting them in the first place? Of course, it's related to liability, but I think it's more like a layered approach with meaningful transparency could be more beneficial. I do not know if that answers your question. At this moment, I think the certification authorities related to auditing certifiers will also need to speed up on this AI to gather the knowledge and to make sure that they have the necessary tools, equipment, personnel to certify these complex AI systems, which may not always be the case yet. I do not know. All right. If you have more questions after my answer, I've been given a real legal answer, so that's good.
Any other comments or questions? Oh, yeah, Daniel.
Well, thanks so much for this, Jan. Really generative, lots of great ideas for research and teaching, so really wonderful. So a question for you about the boundaries of coverage of the law. So you talk about the different modalities of governance, where we can have standards, we can have norms, we can have law. And at least in this case, you express some skepticism that the liability directive is sort of doing the right thing or trying to do the right thing here. We have tried and true methods with the product liability directive. We have gaps that we can iterate on. There's good precedent for doing this, and the AI liability directive is sort of sloppily working with concepts that aren't always applicable. Is this a general problem and limitation of law, or is a directive like this in theory possible? And the reason I raise this kind of question is I'm thinking about systemic risks. But I think about the biggest gaps altogether in the whole AI governance regime, it's things like, in my mind, things like a single product, that makes someone lose their job, that product can be perfectly fit for purpose and reliable, but we still have some social harm. But no individual company is responsible for this. Misinformation, loss of trust, these big systemic risks. There's now some coverage in the AI Act, and sometimes we'll pass new laws like the DSA. Is this how we deal with systemic risks, or is the law capable of evolution, where a new paradigm comes into play? So is this something that you would imagine is useful? Is it not the right way to think about the law? Are there proposals that you do think are sort of relatively revolutionary? Is this required insurance or insurance pools? So what is the scope in your mind of what the law should and shouldn't be doing to tackle these kinds of, especially systemic risks?
Yeah, thank you very much. Also for a very interesting question. Well, for sure, the law has boundaries. It's quite clear that it's often criticized as being far away from technological reality, from the industry, that we have people in Parliament, European Parliament or Belgium, that do not always know how things work. So there has been this criticism. I do think indeed that the DSA, the DMA, the Data Act, the AI Act deal with systemic risk. So whether the measures are enough, I do not know, but at least there's like provisions on GPI models with systemic risk. They are heavily regulated. They have transparency obligations. They have other technological document keeping requirements, and the AI office will even supervise it. So will supervise these models, will really closely follow up on AI systems, on AI models with a systemic risk. So I do think that the law covers that enough to make sure that it's able to follow. Well, one should also know that in these frameworks, and I mainly know the AI Act, but it's also in the Data Act, if I'm not mistaken, there is a lot of delegation to the European Commission. The European Commission can still adopt follow-up delegated acts, can still make sure that if changes are necessary, they can change the articles. So there's some leeway from the European Commission to make sure that the frameworks that are out there remain in force and adapted to the reality, however it will go. For example, also in the Data Act, there are, or the Data Governance Act, I cannot remember it by heart, there's also some provisions on a model contract. So model clauses in data contracts, I think it's a Data Act, where the Commission will adopt these templates, will adopt these examples. And I think this clearly shows that a lot of trust is put in the Commission to follow up on frameworks that have been adopted. So these, according to me, the first step. No, I think it's the first step with a lot of possibilities for delegation acts, for a lot of follow-up initiatives, for refining definitions, for including new AI systems in the high-risk list. So in that way, they try to make it future-proof, but yeah, a major problem with the law is, of course, that it often lags behind, that it takes time to change that. And this is one of the, regardless of the systemic risk, I think this is a reality that the law takes time to make and is not always adapted to the realities in practice, so to say. So in addition to many other challenges that arise there.
Thank you. So time is a runner up. So this is the end of the second session of our symposium. And we have a 10 minutes break, and we resumed our symposium at 4 o'clock. Okay. Thank you, everybody.